So when it comes to brakes, what you don't know can absolutely kill you. And this is an important video, and it's a follow-up to the last one that we did. And that was in response to that 1300 horsepower Mercury crash. And again, the idea here is not to talk about mistakes that were made by the original. We've been down that road. I'm not talking about that. This is about in response to comments and popular misconceptions that can literally cause a lot of grief. So pay attention to all of this, would you please? So one of the first things, one of the most common comments, and again, I read through thousands of them. One of the most common comments was on, quote, emergency brakes, that the car didn't have an emergency brake or he didn't go for an emergency brake. Okay, so emergency brake. This is something that if you're not aware, if you don't understand the operation of these things, can get you in a lot of trouble. So the term emergency brake goes back to the 1930s, right? When hydraulic systems replaced mechanical systems. And the idea was to have still a mechanical connection between the driver and the brakes of the car if there was a hydraulic failure. And that's where the term emergency brake came from. But from that point, they have not been designed as emergency brakes, and it's important you understand this distinction. And if you are going to try to use the, quote, emergency brake, you have to know this, okay? All right. They're designed as parking brakes, mostly so that if you've got a manual transmission car and you're parked on a hill, you can pull the emergency brake, set the emergency brake, and it'll keep the car from creeping along. You know, because the car will sit stationary because of engine compression, but it'll still creep along. So setting the parking brake, the emergency brake, the parking brake, keeps it from rolling away. Okay. To this end, the designers they design a ratchet system into it. So, ratchet system. Let's go to this car right here. So, here's the emergency brake. Okay. Now, if you pull this out, you're pulling a cable that's tightening the rear brakes. But this is ratcheted. Now, if you're in a crisis situation and all you do is just go like that, and they grab, if they grab, you could be in a world of trouble, because what they'll do is they'll lock the back wheels. Unless you're aware of the ratcheting system on that, it'll lock the back wheels, and you're so busy steering and trying to figure out what the hell happened that you're not going to think quickly enough to release the ratcheting mechanism. So, and it's especially true like on a pedal operated emergency brake system. So here's, if you're going to try to use an emergency brake, here's what you need to know about this, right? When you pull the brake, let's just say on this one, this is a common deal from older cars. Ford's had it like this. A lot of the A-body Chryslers had them like this. So if you're going to use this style of brake, you have to keep it twisted. Don't let go of it. You have to keep it twisted, because if you feel the brakes start to grab, then you need to be able to release it a little bit and then pull back into it, because those brakes grab. If those brakes grab while it's out like that, you're in a heap of trouble. So you need to keep the ratcheting mechanism detached in the event of an emergency stop using emergency brakes. They did not design this to be used in an emergency. If they did, it wouldn't have that ratchet that keeps it in place. And if you've got a foot operated pedal and you've got the handle here, while you're operating that foot pedal, you've got to keep the handle all the way out for the same reason. If they start to lock, you got to be able to modulate that brake. Okay, so, and then of course on your hand brakes, you know, the ones that would be over here, they'll have a button on the top. So if you're going to operate the hand brake, always make sure your finger is staying on the button, or again, it'll lock. And what happens is your instinct is to put both hands on the wheel. You know, when you're out of control, it's like you're not thinking, right? Oh, I better go back and release that brake. If you're going to practice with emergency brakes, parking brakes, emergency brakes, whatever you want to call them, make sure that you're aware of overcoming that ratchet mechanism as you're going through the motions. Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what I believe to be the main cause of this crash. And this is something that doesn't apply just to overpowered Mercuries, and this is universal across the board for all cars, trucks, motorcycles, anything and everything. Okay, so, and this car right here, Slaghammer, is actually a good example of what I'm about to talk about. So, when I bought this car, I guess it was probably, I don't know, I guess about 8 years ago now. It was a running, driving car. It was a parts car, right? It was roached. It had been hit everywhere. The interior was destroyed and everything. So I bought it as a running, driving parts car. And when I bought the car from the guy, from the previous owner, I says, so, you know, why are you getting rid of it? And he says, it's got no brakes. He says, no matter what you do, it's just you step on the brakes and it's just, there's nobody home. So I was like, all right, fine. So I winched it up on my trailer, brought it back to the shop, and I was like, okay, well, let's just take a quick look and see what's going on here. Because the car ran, right? So I started up, put it in gear, feel the pedal's perfect, high and firm. I don't know what this guy's talking about, right? So I put it in gear, and I go to drive it away, and I realize I'm standing on the brake pedal. It's like a rock. It's high, it's firm. I'm standing on the brake pedal, and it's barely even slowing down. Like, what the hell is this? So I need to figure this one out. Well, as it turns out, 3 of the 4 wheel cylinders were rusted in place. Right? They were just completely rotted. It was we only had brakes on 1 cylinder. Now remember, a wheel cylinder is actually 2 separate things. So here, I'll show you on this. So a wheel cylinder has 2 push rods that operate the brakes, separate the brakes. Well, the wheel cylinders were rusted internally. So when you stepped on the brakes, there was no motion over here. So how did they rust internally? And this is important. This applies to all of these cars. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, okay, meaning that it will absorb moisture from the air. The longer a car sits, the more moisture, unless the system is completely airtight, the longer it sits, the more moisture will gather in the system. That moisture gravitates to its furthest points. Okay, so the water molecules get in there with the brake fluid. I'm not a chemist. Let's not talk science. I'm talking about practical application. This is what happens. And I've seen this time and time again. I mean, often. It's so common on these older cars, these barn finds, yard finds, right? You know, revival cars, where the pedal feels great, but there's no brakes. So what happens is the moisture gathers in the brake fluid and it migrates to its furthest point, where it then becomes water again. So you have these little water molecules get involved with the brake fluid, they find the end of the line, and then they become water. And that causes wheel cylinders and calipers, for that matter, to rust internally. When they rust internally, they won't operate anymore. They're seized. That's what happened with that car. Now, here's what you need to know about that crash and what I believe caused that crash, okay? It was said that the brakes were done 17 years ago. And honestly, it doesn't matter if they were done 17 years ago or 70 years ago. It shouldn't make any difference how old the brakes are. But what happened was you saw that as they were riding the brakes, as the throttle was stuck and they were riding the brakes, the temperature in the calipers skyrocketed. Those 17-year-old brakes, in all likelihood, had 17-year-old brake fluid in them. And unless they were completely sealed, it meant that each of the calipers had a fair amount of water in the caliper. Because remember, that water migrates to the furthest point. So with that water in the caliper and riding the brakes, the water boiled. When the water boiled, it pushed fluid back up into the master cylinder. Now here's the thing, right? And you have to understand this. Let's say your braking system is completely empty. There isn't a drop of fluid in it. And you fill it with water. You fill the master cylinder with water and you bleed it. You'll have a perfectly high, firm brake pedal. It'll feel completely normal. And if you're going for, let's say, little tiny stops, you know, 10 mile an hour, 20 mile an hour stops with a few minutes between stops, it'll function normally. But if you get that thing to where it's heated up to where the water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. If you get the braking system, the caliper or the wheel cylinder to that 212 degrees, the water boils. When the water boils, it creates a big pocket. And that's what happened with that Comet. As they were dragging the brakes, the temperature kept rising in the caliper. The water separated and boiled. When the water separated and boiled, it backfed through the master cylinder. Now, this whole thing is going to be filled with bubbles and gaps and everything. So the first 2, 3, 4 times that he stepped on the brake, all he was doing was pushing those gaps together. If you're ever in this situation, keep pumping the brakes. It will eventually, it may be after 6 times, 10 times, doesn't matter. Just keep pumping away, because eventually it'll compress all of that air from the boiling fluid and get the brakes to actually start to work. You may not have the most perfect pedal, but you'll have enough of a pedal to hold the car down. There's an old saying well, there's a lot of old sayings, but if you're driving or you're flying, you're in a crisis situation, you keep driving it. You never stop driving it, right? You know, the thing with the airlines, with the pilots is you don't stop flying until you hit the ground, which means that no matter what the situation, you just keep doing it. Just keep trying all different things. Just keep doing things, you know, until the very last instant. And it's the same thing with a brake failure situation. Keep trying things until the very last instant. Never give up, because it could have been that last pump or two that sucked enough mile an hour away from the car that would minimize the crash and turn what was what could have been a really deadly situation into a fender bender. You know, there's no good ways to go about brake failure. You know what I'm saying? So, now there's one other thing I want to cover, okay? One other thing I want to cover. And this has to do with earlier cars that have a single a reservoir master cylinder. So up until 1966, cars had, your master cylinder was one compartment. You fill one compartment with fluid and that's the end of that. In 1967, the federal government mandated that it be split into 2 compartments, right? Now this is not a bad thing, right? But it's not the end all be all, because let me tell you something, having driven hundreds of thousands of miles with both single and dual reservoir master cylinders, they both give exactly the same indication that you need to pull over and figure out what the hell is going on. Because whether it's a single or a dual, when you step on the pedal and the pedal goes beyond its normal travel and feels spongy, it means you have a breach someplace in the system. Wheel cylinder popped, caliper popped, brake line broke, or whatever it happens to be. It doesn't make any difference. You've got a pressure loss. That is your signal to pull over and turn over and stop this thing, figure out what's going on. If you keep driving the car past the point that you've got that, oh, this pedal doesn't feel right, you're asking for trouble. The dual reservoir is just a panacea. Both the single and dual reservoir will give you the same exact indication, and it will get you that same exact emergency stop you need to get pulled over. If you keep driving it past that, yes, the dual reservoir will get you, let's say, 6 more stops than a single reservoir, right? I mean, just to pull a number out of my ass. So you'll be able to get 2 stops if there's a serious problem with the single, and you'll be able to get 6, 7, 8 stops if it's a double. It doesn't make any difference. The first stop is the one that says, hey, you got a problem here. Fix this problem. So that's something I need to bring up, because there's so many people about the phobia about the single reservoir master cylinder. It's nonsense. And one last point, and this goes back to what I was talking about in the previous video about practicing with your brakes. Okay, in that video with the Mercury crash, he talks about how he put it in park, and he said that you can't downshift until you put it in park, because it's a ratchet style shifter. Here's something you have to understand, right? Every car, every aftermarket, especially aftermarket shifter, is a little bit different. They all act a little bit differently. They all have different characteristics and whatnot. Now, I'm very familiar with the shifter that's in that car. I've had it in countless cars. It has a trigger release. Now, you don't have to put it in park to pull it, to downshift it. All you have to do is release it in drive, like just release, don't pull on it or push on it while it's in drive. Lift up on the trigger and you could downshift. He wasn't familiar enough with the operation of that shifter to know that. And I'm not trying to put this guy down or anything like that. This is a teaching moment. This is an example of, that'll make you safer out there, not make him look silly. Practice everything. Practice your stops with no brakes, like we talked about. Practice, if you've got even a stock shifter, know all of the capabilities. Know all of the capabilities. What does this thing do? What happens if I need to downshift, or I need to upshift, or I need to get in a neutral, or whatever it happens to be? You need to practice all of those motions. They should be fluid, and they should be no second guesses. One last thing, and then we leave this topic alone. In a stuck throttle situation like he had with this car, the first thing you should do is kill the ignition. Now, a lot of people said, well, if you kill the ignition, it's an automatic transmission. So if you kill the ignition, the motor stops rotating. So you don't have any engine braking. But that's not true. If the motor is rotating faster than the stall speed of the converter, so let's just say just use round numbers. It's a 2,000 RPM stall converter, and the motor is revving at 2,500, 3,000 RPM. When you kill the ignition, the pump is still turning sufficiently to maintain that connection, that coupling in the torque converter. Okay? Now, if you let the RPM drop below the stall of the converter, then yes, no. When you put it in, when you kill the ignition, there's no connection. But if you kill the ignition while the engine is above the stall speed of the converter, you can quickly downshift into second and then downshift into first, and you'll get engine braking, just the same as if the ignition was on. So don't confuse that, right? I know, you can't push start an automatic, unless it has a rear pump. You can't push start an automatic. I know, I get that, because the motor isn't turning and so the pump isn't turning. But if the motor is rotating 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 RPM, the motor is spinning faster than the stall speed of the converter. So during that period of time, the coupling will be maintained. You could shut the ignition and it'll start to slow down on the engine. And the idea is to downshift as quickly as you can, as quickly as possible, or safely, to maintain that connection. Because as long as the motor is rotating, the pump is rotating. If the pump is rotating, it's circulating fluid, and that connection will be maintained. Once the engine RPM falls under the stall speed of the converter, it'll decouple itself. And at that point, if you've got an emergency brake or a parking brake, that's the time to start using it. So that's it. I know, I'm covering a lot of ground, and I seriously don't mean to keep going back to this one situation, this one video, but this is important stuff, and it shouldn't go to waste. This is one situation, that crash is one situation that combines so many different elements, right? That you really need to dissect it. You really need to go into each of these things and help educate those who are just coming up through the ranks, and practice everything. Practice everything. Okay, when you go for like for instance, if you go for a competition license, a competition racing license, one of the things that they do is a blindfold test. It's a cockpit orientation test. Same thing with pilots. Pilots go through the same thing. So before you can get licensed, you need to be able to operate all of the controls inside the car with your eyes closed. And you have to do it proficiently. You're watched, right? So whoever's administering this will tell you, grab the brake, pull the chute, kill the fuel, right? Whatever it happens to be, and you have to react instantly and know exactly where those controls are and operate them just like that without thinking. You need to take that same attitude towards your own personal hot rod. It could be a 16-second car or a top fuel dragster. It doesn't make any difference. You need to know your car, all of the systems of your car, and how they function. Right? That's the biggest part of all of this. Seriously, it's the biggest. Don't just be a passive piece of meat sitting in the seat. Okay? Be in control of this thing. Be in control of all of its, right? And drive it until the last inch. Never give up. Never give up. Because that 1 mile an hour difference that you can affect in a runaway situation, Right? That could make all the difference in the world. So that's it, guys. I hope you got something out of this, and I'm going to leave this topic behind and move on to other stuff. And I'll see you tomorrow.